Welcome to my channel. Today I am going to share a story that is shocking, heartbreaking, and important. A story about how a single mistake inside a busy American hospital changed lives forever. This is not just about HIV, it is about trust, pressure, and how quickly a normal shift in healthcare can turn into tragedy. The emergency room was overflowing that night, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead while stretchers rolled in one after another, alarms beeping, families waiting, and exhausted nurses trying to keep up. Emily Carter, a 32-year-old registered nurse, had already been working for 12 straight hours, running on caffeine and instinct, just like thousands of other nurses across the country who battle exhaustion while trying to protect their patients. That night she had two new cases. The first was Daniel, a thin young man struggling to breathe with pneumonia. His medical history mentioned HIV testing, but no results were listed. He needed IV antibiotics quickly. A few rooms away was Mark Jensen, a strong construction worker in his 40s who had collapsed from dehydration on the job. His case seemed simple, just fluids and rest. But when Emily opened the supply cart, she found a serious problem. The stock of clean syringes had run out. The hospital had been cutting costs and everyone was improvising. Across the hall, another patient was crashing. Another nurse was shouting for help. Alarms were ringing. And in that moment of chaos, Emily made a decision she would regret forever. She picked up the syringe she had already used, convincing herself it was only saline, convincing herself that it would be harmless, just this once. Daniel coughed violently as she started his IV, his body weak from infection. Minutes later, she walked into Mark's room and hung his fluid bag, reusing the same syringe in her rush to keep up with the night. Mark managed a faint smile, grateful for her care, completely unaware of the hidden danger. The hours passed, emergencies stacked up, and Emily pushed forward, barely remembering that small shortcut as she worked until dawn. She went home exhausted, unaware that in that brief moment she had set in motion a silent shadow, an invisible mistake, one that would not reveal itself until months later when Mark Jensen sat in a doctor's office and heard words that shattered his life. "You are HIV positive." Months passed after that chaotic night in the ER, and life seemed to return to normal for everyone. Except beneath the surface, something invisible was growing. Daniel, the young man with pneumonia, went home with his diagnosis already known to him, though he never returned to the hospital for follow-up. Mark Jensen, the construction worker, finished his fluids, walked out of the ER with a smile, and never imagined he carried something new inside his blood. At first, nothing seemed wrong. He went back to work, back to his family, back to long summer days on the construction site. But slowly his energy began to fade. He felt tired in the mornings, chalked it up to age and long hours. Then came the night sweats, the sudden weight loss, the strange fevers that never quite broke. His wife noticed the changes first, pressing him to see a doctor. Mark resisted at first, thinking it was just stress, but eventually gave in. The doctor ordered blood work, expecting maybe diabetes or thyroid issues. When the results came back, the doctor looked uneasy. He asked Mark about his history, about drug use, about sexual partners, about any blood transfusions. Mark shook his head each time, confused and frustrated, insisting he had lived a faithful and careful life. Then came the words he could hardly process. The test was positive for HIV. Mark's world collapsed in that moment. He sat in stunned silence, his wife crying beside him, both of them asking how such a thing could be possible. There were no answers yet, only disbelief and fear. The doctor tried to reassure them about treatment options, about modern medicine keeping the virus under control, but all Mark could think was that his life had been stolen from him by something he never saw coming. And somewhere in the hospital records, buried deep in charts and shift reports, the real answer waited, the clue that would soon unravel a mystery linking one man's diagnosis to a single night, a single syringe, and a nurse's exhausted mistake. Mark tried to go on with his daily life, but the diagnosis haunted him. He took the prescribed medications, followed the doctor's instructions, and tried to convince himself that modern treatment would keep him safe. But his mind kept circling back to the same impossible question. How had he been infected? He replayed the years in his head, thinking about every doctor visit, every hospital stay, every moment that could have gone wrong. His wife, terrified and angry, demanded answers. She believed him when he said he had been faithful, but the weight of the unknown pressed down on both of them, creating cracks in their marriage. The local doctor referred Mark to an infectious disease specialist, someone who dealt with complicated cases. During the first appointment, the specialist sat across from him with a serious look and asked detailed questions. No history of drug use, no history of risky behavior, no transfusions. It didn't add up. The specialist grew curious, digging into Mark's medical history. There it was, months earlier, a short admission to the ER for dehydration. A simple IV drip, nothing more. It shouldn't have mattered, but the specialist had seen strange cases before and knew that sometimes the answer hid in the smallest details. Around the same time, another patient from the same hospital, treated in the same ER, appeared with the same unexpected HIV diagnosis. Two men with no risk factors, both connected to one place, one night. The pieces of the puzzle began to shift, faint patterns emerging. Mark didn't know it yet, but an investigation was coming. His case was no longer just about one man's illness. It was becoming a question about hospital safety, medical errors, and a system that might have failed more than one patient. And somewhere, Nurse Emily Carter lived her life unaware that her decision months ago was about to return, pulling her into a storm that would change everything. The questions around Mark's diagnosis quickly grew too loud to ignore. His specialist, disturbed by the unusual case, contacted the hospital where Mark had been treated. At first, the administrators brushed it off, confident their procedures were sound, but as soon as they heard that another patient from the same ER night had also tested positive, alarm bells began to ring. An internal investigation was opened, chart reviews ordered, and nurses from that night were quietly interviewed. As the details came together, a troubling picture formed. Two patients, same shift, same wing, both developing HIV despite having no traditional risk factors. The hospital infection control team grew nervous, knowing that if a link was confirmed, it could mean malpractice, lawsuits, and public outrage. They checked supply logs and found shortages of syringes documented that week. They traced the timeline back to the night Nurse Emily Carter had worked, her name appearing on both patients' charts. Emily herself barely remembered the cases until she was asked to explain. The moment the investigators mentioned the syringe shortage, her heart sank. Memories of the chaos that night, of the corner she cut, came rushing back. She felt the room close in around her, guilt rising like a tidal wave. She admitted she had reused a syringe, her voice trembling, insisting she had thought it was harmless at the time. The investigators exchanged grim looks because they knew what this meant. The hospital now faced a nightmare. Two innocent men infected, a nurse's mistake exposed, and a system that had failed both its patients and its staff. For Mark, the mystery of how he had contracted HIV was finally beginning to unravel, but the answer brought no comfort, only rage and grief. For Emily, the truth was out, and she stood on the edge of losing not just her career but everything she believed about herself as a caregiver. And for the hospital, the story was only beginning, because the shadow of that one syringe was about to move from quiet investigation into the harsh light of the courtroom. The investigation's findings spread quickly through the hospital like a fire no one could contain. The administrators, desperate to keep control, gathered lawyers and public relations experts, but it was too late. Mark Jensen and his family were already demanding answers, and when the truth was presented to them, the shock turned into fury. The idea that a trusted hospital, a place meant to heal, had allowed such a basic failure to happen was unbearable. For Mark, the truth brought clarity but no relief. He had been faithful, careful, responsible, and yet he now carried a virus for life, not because of choices he made, but because of a shortcut taken by someone else. His wife stood beside him, torn between supporting her husband and fighting the anger that their lives had been stolen in a single moment. Across town, Nurse Emily Carter was falling apart. The moment she confessed to the investigators replayed in her mind endlessly. She remembered the chaos, the noise, the panic of that shift, the empty supply cart, and her own exhausted reasoning that it was only saline. Now that decision had names, faces, consequences she could never undo. She could barely sleep, barely eat, waiting for the call that she knew would come. And then it did. She was summoned to appear in front of the hospital review board, her trembling hands gripping the letter. They informed her that her license was suspended pending further hearings, and that her actions were now part of a legal case. Emily wept, her career crumbling, her life's purpose dissolving in shame. The hospital itself braced for lawsuits, knowing that once the story reached the public, outrage would come crashing down. For Mark, the time of confusion was over. Now came the fight for justice. For Emily, the truth was undeniable, but whether she was a villain or a victim of a broken system would soon be decided in a place colder and more unforgiving than any ER, the courtroom. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the trial, a tense silence filling the air as people waited for the proceedings to begin. Reporters lined the back rows, pens ready, cameras flashing in the hallways. At the center of it all sat Mark Jensen, no longer the strong construction worker everyone once knew, but a man carrying the heavy weight of an illness he never asked for. Beside him, his wife held his hand tightly, her face a mixture of sorrow and determination. Across the aisle sat Nurse Emily Carter, her shoulders slumped, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights, her lawyer whispering instructions she could barely hear. To the world, she was the nurse who had spread HIV through negligence, but inside, she still thought of herself as a caregiver who had made a desperate mistake in impossible conditions. The attorneys made their opening statements, one side describing the tragedy of a man's life forever altered by careless malpractice, the other painting Emily as a scapegoat for a hospital system plagued by understaffing and shortages. Witnesses took the stand. Doctors explained how HIV is transmitted, specialists described the strict protocols meant to prevent it, and experts testified about the hospital's failing supply chain. Every word cut into Emily, reminding her of the choice she had made under pressure. Mark testified as well, his voice breaking as he told the jury about the moment he heard his diagnosis, the disbelief, the rage, the way his marriage and future had been shaken. He stared across the room at Emily, not with hatred, but with a kind of exhausted pain that asked why his life had been taken in this way. Emily herself was eventually called to testify. Her voice trembled as she admitted what she had done, tears falling as she tried to explain the chaos of that night, the exhaustion, the shortage, and the thought that it was only saline. The jury listened closely, faces grim, some sympathetic, others stern. This was more than a case about one syringe. It was a case about human error, broken systems, and the thin line between responsibility and blame. The gavel struck, the questioning ended, and everyone knew that the verdict would not only decide Mark's future compensation, but also whether Emily Carter would leave the courtroom as a reckless criminal or a tragic reminder of a healthcare system stretched beyond its limits. The day of the verdict arrived with a heavy silence that hung over the courtroom like a storm about to break. The jurors filed in, faces unreadable, carrying the weight of weeks of testimony and evidence. Mark Jensen sat stiffly in his chair, his wife's hand locked in his, both of them bracing for the words that would shape the rest of their lives. Across the aisle, Nurse Emily Carter sat pale and trembling, her lawyer whispering for her to stay calm, though her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. When the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict, the words struck like hammers. The jury found the hospital guilty of negligence, ruling that the system's failures had directly led to Mark's infection. Damages were awarded to Mark and his family, a financial recognition of a loss that money could never truly repair. For Emily, the outcome was mixed. She was spared criminal conviction, the jury recognizing the crushing conditions and shortages that had influenced her decision, but her nursing license was permanently revoked. Her career, the identity she had built her life around, was gone forever. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she realized she would never again wear her uniform, never again walk into a hospital as the caregiver she once believed herself to be. Mark listened as the judge confirmed the award, his heart heavy with complicated feelings. Justice, perhaps, but not peace. No amount of money could erase the virus in his blood, the endless pills, the fear of stigma, or the uncertainty of his future. When he left the courthouse, reporters crowded him, microphones thrust in his face, but he had no speech prepared. All he could say was that he wanted people to understand this was preventable, that trust in healthcare is sacred, and that mistakes like this should never happen again. Emily slipped quietly out a side door, avoiding cameras, her life shattered but her conscience forced to live with the memory of a single moment, one syringe and the shadow it cast. And as the courthouse emptied, the case closed and the crowd dispersed, the echoes of what happened that night in the ER remained, a painful reminder of how fragile safety can be when systems fail and human beings are pushed beyond their limits. The story did not end with the courtroom, because tragedies like this never truly end. Mark Jensen returned home with his wife, clutching the papers that detailed the compensation he had won, but no legal document could restore the life he had before that night in the ER. He faced a future of daily medication, regular checkups, and the constant burden of explaining his condition to those who might not understand. Yet despite his grief, he chose to speak publicly, hoping that by telling his story he could prevent the same mistake from happening to others. Nurse Emily Carter disappeared from the profession she once loved, her license revoked, her reputation gone, yet she remained a human being haunted by the memory of one desperate choice made in exhaustion and chaos. For her, the punishment was not only professional but deeply personal, a lifetime of carrying guilt for the patients she harmed. The hospital implemented new protocols, stricter supply management, and mandatory safety checks. But for the victims, these reforms came too late. In the larger picture, the case became a symbol of the fragile balance between human error and systemic failure, a warning about what happens when healthcare workers are stretched too thin, when corners are cut, and when the smallest lapse can ripple outward with devastating consequences. For the public, it was a painful reminder that hospitals, though built to heal, are not immune to mistakes, and that vigilance, investment, and accountability are essential to protect both patients and staff. And for those listening to this story now, the lesson is clear. Trust in medicine is sacred, safety is not optional, and behind every statistic, every lawsuit, and every headline, there are real human lives changed forever by moments that cannot be undone. Thank you for listening to this story. If it moved you, if it made you think, or if it opened your eyes to the hidden struggles inside our healthcare system, I invite you to stay connected with this channel. Here we share stories that are not only about medicine and mistakes, but about the human cost, the lessons learned, and the voices that deserve to be heard. Remember, behind every headline there is a life, behind every case there is a family, and behind every mistake there is a lesson for us all. Stay safe, take care of each other, and I'll see you in the next story.